In the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, people tried to analyze what exactly it was that made the Hutus and Tutsis, Hutus hack the Tutsis to death, chop off their limbs, rape them, rape their children when they had lived next to them peacefully for so many years. What they found shocked the world. They found that in areas where the state radio was broadcasting hate messages about the Tutsis, saying that they are aliens, they are inhuman, you must kill them and retain the purity of our nation, in those areas, the intensity of the killing was much higher. It wasn't that the people in these areas were more cruel or more inhumane than the people in other areas. It was a fact that it is a myth to say that speech cannot influence people. It is a myth to say that people cannot be influenced by what is told to them over and over and over. That's why we think that the right to hate is not a right at all. What do you have to prove to you to win this debate? We have to prove to you that hate speech is a violation of the balance of rights and actively harms society. Team Kuwait has to defend a world where minorities are vulnerable and targeted and their rights are less important than hate speech. What is our policy? First, by comments, we mean incitement of violence, attacks on their identity, like attacking a Muslim for wearing a hijab, perpetrating harmful stereotypes about these people, like, for example, Mexicans are rapists and Muslims are terrorists. We think this debate is specifically about minorities, and we think it's more about these people because they're much more likely to be hated on in the first place. They're much more likely to face these kinds of microaggressions, to face this kind of attack on their identity than a privileged majority. We have 4 arguments to bring you today. First, on why hate speech violates people's rights. Second, why the repetition of speech is dangerous. My second thing will tell you about media discourse and why minorities are heard on their side. On to my first argument as to how hate speech violates people's rights. This matters because freedom of speech is the banner that they will hide behind. Freedom of speech is not absolute. There is always a balance of right that needs to be considered, and in cases where your speech is infringing on someone else's rights, it can and legitimately be bullied. How is it true? Yes.
Don't you believe that if you put this barrier that people are allowed to publicize their comments, won't they simply form closed communities which could trigger violence instead of just simply comments?
Well, the thing is, if they want to trigger violence, well, the police exist to stop quite that. Furthermore, if people are already so radicalized that they will cause violence to minorities in the first place, that wouldn't change on your side of the house either. That's something that isn't exclusive to both sides. People who are extreme will always exist. That's not a reason to excuse what they do. So how is it true that freedom of speech shouldn't apply here? Because first, this kind of speech threatens their identities. When Muslims can't wear the veil in public, when gay people cannot hold hands with their partners, and they can't practice their very identity and what is incredibly important to them, we think that's a fundamental breach of their rights in a climate where they're not allowed to do this without feeling threatened. Second, because it creates an unsafe climate for their very personal safety. People live in fear for no reason because of the fact that the right can be taken away at any moment by someone who will shoot them because of their identity. Thirdly, because it's disproportionately against minorities, people who are the most vulnerable in the status quo, the people who are already threatened the most in our society, they are the ones who are most affected by this speech. They need special protection because of all these disenfranchisement. In this debate, we need to view this through the balance of rights. The freedom of speech cannot be viewed as more important as the right to life and religious freedom. That's why we think this motion stands. No. Second argument as to why the repetition of speech makes this speech dangerous and how we change this. This matters because there's a vast difference between an individual comment and a culture of speech. Anyone can make an individual comment about anyone. Like, for example, it's quite possible that people in privileged groups could also face individual comments on their appearance or on their sort of identity. The fact is, those are much smaller. The thing is, there's a much more culture of speech against people from minorities. The fact is, it's the culture of speech that matters. Why? Because when you have certain words and phrases being repeated over a period of time, like Muslims are terrorists, like Syrians are terrorists, that's the kind of thing that actually has an impact. An isolated incident of speech does not have the sort of impact that a culture of speech does. This kind of hostile culture and microaggression that minorities face as a result of this repetition of speech is incredibly harmful. How is this true? Through 2 main ways. First, because people are convinced over time. If something is doubted at first, like for example, people might not always believe that Muslims are terrorists when they first hear it, every other time it's repeated, every additional time it becomes more and more convincing. That's the very secret behind propaganda. It was used to great effect by the United States before and after World War II. During World War II, they painted Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe, as their ally in the fight against Nazi war machine, and they painted him as the enemy of Nazism and the friend of freedom and someone they could trust. And the American public believed this because they were bombarded with the repeated series of advertisements, of pictures of Stalin and Roosevelt meeting and shaking hands. This is what they believed. That's why they believed that he was their friend. But then 10 years later, the exact same advertisement campaign was run to show Stalin as the enemy of freedom, as a communist dictator who threatened everything that they stood for. And the very same people who had believed this first ad campaign believed the second one, because of the fact that it was again the bombardment of speech, again the bombardment of images and advertising that was convincing to them, because of the fact that people are simply influenced by something that they hear over and over again. We saw this moreover when the Germans didn't actually hate Jews before the World War II, but then when Hitler repeated it over and over and over again, we saw in interviews of Nazi soldiers after World War II that many of them genuinely believed that Jews were the enemy. They believed because Hitler told it to them so many times, not because they were bad people. This is even true in daily life, as you see, when children are bullied, they are convinced by other people that they are fat, that they are ugly, that there is something wrong with them. It's something that leads to anorexia, eating disorders. Even as the time goes by, they can't shake this perception because of the fact it's been repeated so much to them. That's why they believe it. And the second, through non-exposure. Quite often we don't see or interact these other groups of people. The only exposure is through this kind of speech which leads to discriminatory attitudes. We see, for example, Donald Trump's high approval ratings in predominantly white areas. The fact is, when he says things like Mexicans are rapists, there isn't much evidence to disprove him in predominantly white areas. That's why they're able to buy the things he says. But in areas where it isn't true, where they're much more cosmopolitan, people don't believe him because they know what he's saying is not true. But in those predominantly white areas, his speech fosters an attitude of hatred towards minorities, hatred towards Mexicans. We think that's harmful. As a consequence of this internalization, you have societal attitudes trending towards hatred and discrimination. Like the example I gave you of Rwanda and how speech was influenced there. On their side, the discourse between groups is unbalanced. Because when it's dominated by majority people, when all the media houses and analysts are white people, people of majority, people of privilege who dominate the discourse, there isn't a simple balance of speech. It's not that both sides have an equal say. Like, for example, the fact that Black Lives Matter is denied airtime in the United States and dismissed as an extremist group despite having very legitimate concerns about racism and police brutality. Because of the fact that the existing culture of speech is one that treats minorities as dangerous, much more likely to be criminals. That's what happens on their side. But on our side, we filter this kind of hate speech. We generate much more balanced discourse. We reduce the kind of fear that minorities have to live in. We reduce societal tension and we help people find a way to live their lives in peace. We protect them from the kind of discrimination that they want to expose them to on their side. Because the right to hate is not a right at all. I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you, Kartik, for your speech. I might not like to call Yusuf.
Could I use my phone to time, please? Ladies and gentlemen, adjudicators, worthy opponents, and fellow teammates, good afternoon. My name is Yusuf Usama Ahmed Muhammad Mahmoud. I am a Muslim. Allahu Akbar. See, I just poked fun at my own religion and my teammate's religion. Is he offended? No. He's sat right there. He's smiling. He's laughing. Should I go to jail for this? No. But if someone acts upon this, and it's not always the case that someone is going to act upon this. We are all rational people in this room, so I hope. If someone acts upon my comment and goes and starts hating Muslims and commits assaults against them, then they should be the ones held liable and not us. And this is the core of our case. It's the absolute nature of free speech. The absolute nature of free speech is that you can say what you want, and if that does spark hatred, which it won't always spark hatred, but if it does, you should not be held liable. It's the people with the twisted minds who twist your words and act upon these words. These are the ones who should be held liable for that. No, thank you. So, allow me before getting into my rebuttal to outline our case for today. I, the first speaker of the opposition, will be talking about the absolute nature of free speech. And my second speaker will be talking about how this would harm society and further inspire hatred. So first of all, I'd like to refute a few of the points proposed by the proposition today. They mentioned the Rwandan genocide and how the radios were sending out messages of hate. This is typical in lands where there are tribes. There are usually feuds between tribes, and so if the radio station goes and pumps this feud up, it's not necessarily their fault. Again, as I said before, the people who act upon this, these are the people who should be held liable. Also,
point of information.
Okay.
Do minorities in society have the exact same access to speech and media as majorities do?
Could you clarify your point, please?
Do minorities in society have the exact same access to speech and media as majorities do?
Yes, of course. This motion is for everyone. We believe it shouldn't be a criminal offense for anyone to voice their opinion. Everyone can say whatever they want. That is the absolute nature of free speech, which I'll be getting onto later. However, we do not exclude minorities from our case. Our case involves everyone. Everyone can say what they want without feeling without it violating their freedom of speech. Also, they said that there should be that we already have the police force to implement the law. However, later on they went on to contradict themselves by saying minorities live in fear. How do minorities live in fear when you already said that the police force is there to protect them? No, thank you. Also, they talked about how the repetition of speech will inspire hatred. However, that is propaganda, and these are comments that are always fueled and said to inspire hatred among people. However, this does not involve what they said is not involved as a part of our motion, because the motion talks about
point of information.
No, thank you. Talks about a criminal offense. Talks about making comments that could inspire hatred a criminal offense. However, what they were talking about was propaganda, which are always made to fuel people to hate each other. We, as the proposition, have to prove why it shouldn't be made a criminal offense to have your right to free speech. However, the proposition wants to create more acceptance and less hatred among the society. However, this is, again, the core of our case. They want to create less hatred in society. However, these comments are not supposed to create more hatred in society. It's just people voicing their opinion. It's their absolute right to free speech. And since it's their absolute right to free speech, they should not be held liable for the actions of other radical people who take these words too seriously and act upon them. Your free speech is your right to voice your opinion, and you can't oppress people from their right, because freedom of speech is a human right. That is a fact that can't be refuted. And so, to say that to make it a criminal offense for someone to voice their right, to voice their opinion, that is taking away their human right, which is oppressing them. And if it causes someone else to act upon their comment, as I'm repeating time and time again, it cannot be their responsibility. It's not the original commenter's responsibility, it's the person who acted upon that. I'll take you in just a moment. We already have laws to punish the people who assault others for their race, their gender identity, their sexuality, their religion. We already have laws in place for people who assault these people. However, people whom are just stating their opinion, there are no laws against that, because it is freedom of speech, and so there can be no law to violate a human right. Don't you agree?
Do people have the right to religious freedom?
Yes, of course, people have the right to religious freedom, and that actually leads me perfectly on to my next point. If people can't say what they believe in, sometimes people voice what they believe in because it is a part of their religion. For example, some religions do not agree with the point of homosexuality. So to say that some people cannot voice their opinion and the teachings of their religion, if they can't voice what they want to say because it's what their religion taught them, that's basically prosecuting against them for their religion. And that is apparently what Team Proposition are promoting right here. It is to suppress people from saying what they want to, and it's sometimes not out of hatred, it's just the teachings that they were given. Also, what if let us consider the people who are making these comments. What if these comments are as a result of, let's say, a mental disability, a mental retardation, narcissism, autism, Down syndrome. For example, autism and mental retardation, people who have autism and mental retardation do not have a built-in filter to know what they should say and what they should not say. And so it would be impossible to make this a criminal offense for them, because it's a mental disability that they cannot control. And so it would be unequal in society to make it a criminal offense for other people, which is why the principle of this motion of making it a criminal offense for people who comment such comments, this is why in principle it's wrong to send these people to jail, to punish them by law. So what have I told you today, ladies and gentlemen? I've told you why the absolute nature of free speech makes this motion fall. Because the absolute nature of free speech is that someone should be able to say what they want to say. And it considers people who want to voice their religion, people who want to voice something but they cannot control what they have to say because due to the mental illnesses that I just mentioned. And so this absolute nature of free speech makes this motion fall. Thank you.
So thank you, Yusuf, for your speech. It's now my pleasure to ask Helen to give the speech.
Panel, so far in human society, we have seen too many propaganda machines depend on their ability to reiterate certain forms of speech in every aspect of that particular community's life to further their message. We saw the Nazi propaganda machine weaponize hatred using hate speech. We saw the Milosevic propaganda machine using the repetitive nature of speech and the powerful nature of speech to further hatred against minorities. We saw in the US during the World War how speech was specifically used as a tool to foster hate against the Japanese community to such an extent that even 10 years after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombing happened, 71% of the population still in a poll voted that the bombing was justified. We saw how in Rwanda the radio was used as a tool to spread specific hateful messages to create communal hatred, to create sectarianism, and to foster conflict. We think at the point at which they failed to recognize our most important argument in this debate, that speech can be harmful, that repetition of speech can be harmful, that at the point at which the speech that you hear about a particular minority is your first and most important exposure to that community, if that speech is hateful, it can be harmful, they automatically lose this debate because they fail to recognize that. What did they tell you throughout their first speech? their entire first, they spent 8 minutes asserting to us that free speech is absolute. We told you no. No rights are absolute. Rights are always viewed in a balance, specifically if they conflict with other fundamental rights. And what are fundamental rights? Rights like the right to life, rights like the right to security, basic quality of life. At the point at which we prove to you conclusively that the freedom of speech of some hateful individuals conflicts with the freedom of speech, with the right to life and the right to security of vastly large communities, of vastly large minorities, we automatically won this debate because any right has to be viewed from this balance. But to this they had to tell you that no, it's the onus has to be placed on the individual who used the speech and not the person who said the speech. Two things. It is quite bizarre to say that we need to depend on people's ability to not to not take in what you are given through speech. It is quite bizarre to say that individuals can continually pump incitement of violence, but that only acting on that violence is harmful when the intent behind pumping that incitement of violence itself is to target those minorities. It is quite bizarre to say that when at the point at which your speech is the unique tool that you use to attack groups that you dislike and hate upon, to massively increase that hatred also, that it doesn't qualify as harm. But secondly, to this they tell you that no, laws already exist to prevent hate crimes, for example. So they concede to us that it is a legitimate policy for states to have greater penalties for hate crimes against minority gender orientations or minority religious groups, for example. Therefore, we think at the point at which they concede that one particular form of attack on an identity is apparently fair, but another type of attack on their identity is unfair. At the point at which they tell you, if you are physically assaulted as a result of you being a brown person or a black person in the Western world, you should be prosecuted, but you shouldn't be prosecuted if you attack them on their mental state. Because they talk to you about mental health also, if you attack them on the most basic part of their life, that is their identity, it is somehow fair. We think it is morally indistinguishable as to how some particular part of attack on a particular group is different from a physical form of attack. We just don't recognize the principle behind this. The final death blow they had to their own case was when they conceded in a POI that all individuals have a right to religious freedom. That is to say that they recognize the fundamental and universal nature of these types of rights and say that any form of right that therefore infringes on these rights, any form of act that attempts to deny people this right is therefore automatically, by their definition, a criminal offense. We have already won this debate. But the only last thing they had to talk to you about was about mentally retarded people who apparently we are now suppressing from being able to say what we want. First of all, we think this debate is largely not about interpersonal communications. But second, we think even in the case where you have to take the exceptional example where one mentally retarded person is now prosecuted under this, we think already in the law mitigating sentences exist in which the personal conditions are considered. I'll take a POI.
Yes, under your model and in your world, if someone voices homophobia because it's, let's say, for example, in Islam, would you still consider that a criminal offense?
We think at the point at which, again, we say rights are viewed in balance. If your right to expression is infringing on the rights of a person to access a basic quality of life and security, yes, that will be considered as a criminal offense under this policy. What is my first constructive for you today? That hateful speech perpetuates the disenfranchisement of minorities. Panel, imagine being born into hatred, ubiquitous hatred, where every nook and corner for you, in the news, in the jokes that your friends crack, and in the microaggressions that you face on a daily basis, attempt to ostracize you from the majority. And imagine that as a result, you as a community are forced to escape this by isolating yourself. As a gay individual, you don't want to hold hands with your partner. You don't want to dance in public because you know that there will be some form of hatred being perpetrated against you, that you will be made a joke. We told you already in our first speech why these kinds of microaggressions are fostered and perpetuated by the repetitive nature of speech. But at the point at which this form of speech happens, we think it is encouraging isolation and forcing communities into isolated communities. We think this already happens, for example, in large parts of the Western world, when African American communities form ethnic enclaves and don't want to interact with the rest of society because of the resentment that these forms of speech create. We think as a state, we should work towards the integration of these vulnerable communities, into the inclusion of these communities into our political systems, into our society, and so on. Therefore, we argue that when their side is actively preventing this disenfranchisement, it has to be changed, and we do this. But second, we think we also create more positive things. When firstly, what we say is that as a result of creating this filter of removing hate speech, we create more favorable speech to these communities, and these communities feel more included in society. But secondly, we create an active statement that as a state we condemn any form of speech that tries to attack you, that tries to suppress your rights. I'll take you.
So basically, just like the Nazis, you would wish to completely change everyone's opinion to fit your ideas?
Panel, once again we're telling you, this is not about radically changing the way we portray society or see society, but about allowing individuals to access basic quality of life, a right to life and right to dignity. They have to tell us why that's apparently less important than the freedom of expression. Therefore, we tell you that what the statement we create through our policy is that you matter to us, and that is legitimate. But secondly, we think we also create a more favorable media discourse. They can't just say that media discourse exists on their videos, because clearly speech is unequal. In forms of like numerical majorities existing, privilege meaning that only white people, for example, own corporations and own media houses, privilege meaning that they're more likely to be as panelists on these TV shows. We think a large amount of this discourse is concentrated in these hands of these privileged communities, and therefore perpetuates hateful speech. We think discourse doesn't work when this is so, because clearly this is the status quo and it's not working given the rise of nativism. But rather we think by suppressing these forms of discourse, we are giving this airtime to more favorable groups, like for example the Black Lives Matter movement, and as a result of this, we're creating more positive outcomes. The right to hate is not a right at all.
Thank you, Emma, for your speech. Please welcome Saad, the second speaker of the opposition side.
Can I use my phone to time? Can I start? Not to repeat the opening style of my first speaker, but I'm a Muslim. This is a comment which, in people who have something against Islam, it might inspire feelings of hatred towards me. Today we've seen a side proposition which fails to take into the account the actual person who is actually making such comments, and also they would rather have us enforce our idea of not having any real free speech and forcing us to always conform to their ideals. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how their policy actually has harms for society and actually works to further inspire hatred. But before I do so, I'd like to just offer a bit of rebuttal to what they've brought to the table so far. This was a point, firstly, this is a point that was raised by the proposition, one of their point of information. They talked about, in our world, would there be religious freedom? Would people be free to practice their religion? And really our response to that is that in our world, yes, if something...
Point of information.
No, thank you. If there's something in your religion which might be offensive towards another minority in society, if you choose to voice that, but you're not actually physically participating or harming these other people, and if other people aren't harming these other people, then there shouldn't really be any criminal offense to that. Whereas in their world, if anything you say, even if it is derived from religion, even if it is derived from some mental disability or some disorder that you have, you are still supposed to be criminally punished. So basically what they're promoting for is, amongst other things, a society of religious prosecution, where, for example, if you're homophobic as a result of your religion, you're not allowed to say that because you'll be put to jail. We don't think that's right. And really, just to push this point, to really drive this point home, I want to just draw upon what my first speaker says, which is the absolute nature of free speech. Free speech is just that. It's free, and it's speech. You can say it, You can speak your mind, but if no one is actually implementing it, if no one is actually inflicting harm, then we do not believe that it is something which should be criminally recognized. Having said that, I want to move on to another really important point of their case, which has been consistent throughout, and they've been talking about repetition, or rather the phrasing that they use, a culture of hate speech. And they talked about how this would always, how this is a form of propaganda, and how this would definitely incite hatred. But ladies and gentlemen, what we're talking about today is speech which may or may not promote hatred. Speech which is relative in its nature. Speech which can be parsed and perceived in multiple different ways, which is not guaranteed to promote hatred. And thus really the entire premise that they've put forth based on that argument, that forcibly having such speech, that whole argument and their entire case on that stance doesn't really stand, because it's based on a flawed premise which isn't relevant to this debate. Having said that, and I'd like to move on to talk about my main case one, which is all about really how this works to damage society and how this actually works to further incite harm. Firstly, if you suppress a person for expressing their opinion, for just speaking what their ideals are, which might not again be their fault, as that first speaker pointed out. No, thank you. Which might not be their fault, just because it might be because of their background and because of the culture that they've been exposed to, which is not their fault. If they're put in prison, do you think that this is going to automatically reform them and have them enter society again as a reformed citizen? Or do you think though the years or the months they spend in prison, spend penalized as a result of their free expression, don't you agree that they're going to feel that those years that they've been deprived of are a result of the minority that they were initially expressing hatred towards? Don't you believe that there are other more peaceful means, which is what we're going for on our side of the house, peaceful means of reform as opposed to violent, oppressive means of reform? Don't you think it's more peaceful and more equal and complying with human rights, as Team Proposition put it, to educate these people through more social and more accepting means as opposed to forcing them into your opinions? That's what we believe on our side of the house. Second, I'd like to just draw up a picture for you. In society, I think we can agree that most people who are accused of such racism or such misogyny, such homophobia, and etc., these people are adults. All people who live in society I'll take in a moment, are part of some sort of societal unit. Now, if this person goes to jail or is criminally penalized as a result of expressing their views, do you think that the views of their society are going to become increasingly favorable, or they're going to have increasingly feelings of hatred towards this group of minority? Yes, please.
If hate speech makes a Muslim person not want to wear a skull cap on the streets of New York, how is it different from actively and physically stopping them from doing the same thing?
Thank you. I don't think it should, because in your world, which we are living in, you have police to protect these people from physical assault. So unless you're saying that your very means of protection aren't valid, I don't think how that's really something to bring to our side of the case. Okay, so again, just going back to what I was talking about, it's the whole idea of societal impact. Societal units, when you pick away from them, when you start, in essence, cleansing the speech that they're bringing to the table just for the purpose of enforcing your own ideals, you have to remember and consider what effect that has on the remaining societal units. It's going to result in an increased feeling of the fact that these people are targeted, the fact that these people are being oppressed. And again, if you want a very relevant example, if for example, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, if these people are being systematically targeted because they're not conforming with the idea of peaceful conformity to the system, then the societal units which are remaining are going to feel more hostility towards themselves. And another point I want to make today is the whole idea of how far does this go? Okay, even if we accept them on their highest ground, that yes, you should have some moderation in terms of speech, how far are you willing to push the idea of a criminal offense? Because believe it or not, society isn't always serious. As was evident with my first speaker's opening statement, we like to laugh at ourselves. And really, a lot of things, for example, we were slightly late to arriving at this debate, and you might consider that Arab timing, just because it's a convention that we're always late to things. But that's not something which necessarily insults me. So if someone, even as I started my speech, I talked about a Muslim. If your speech if your speech inspires hatred in someone else, If what you say, if you are just promoting your belief, and this leads to a feeling of hatred in someone else, we don't see how you yourself are criminally liable for actually doing that. We believe that that team proposition is willing to transfer accountability in order to forcibly bring about an ideological change. And really, if there's one thing I wanted to take away from my speech, it might not be all the nuances I picked at, it might not be the specifics. All I want you to really take away is the idea of accountability. The idea that if you are choosing to enact one of your human rights, are you really to blame if someone else perverses that human rights and acts on it so as to violate other people? Is that really your responsibility? So really, at the end of the day, what we want you to remember is this motion talks about speech which may or may not enforce hatred. Speech which is relative, speech which can be perceived in a variety of ways. And we believe, on our side of the house, that such speech is not justified in being penalized through the law, which is why this motion must fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach, for your speech. I'd now like to call Ellen and Jay to give the speech.
At this point, panel, we need to take a step back and reevaluate what we think rights are. We from side proposition think that rights are basically choices. The right to life over the right to religion. The choice as to whether or not you get to choose to enforce your religion over another person and invalidate that person's right to exist as a whole. Rights as society and as the state gives them out are choices at the end of the day. We impose rights to maximize the choices of our people. That's the basic principle of democracy, and that's the basic principle which we for side proposition have stood for throughout this entire debate. And through that matrix, we need to view whether or not this law is legitimate, whether the trade-off of choices on either side of the house is favorable. And we say that when we look at through that matrix, it's definitely side proposition that takes this debate. So what are the questions in this debate? Firstly, what exactly are rights for in this case, and is the freedom of speech more valuable than an individual's freedom to life and his freedom to be who he is or who they are? Okay? Firstly, they asserted to you continuously that the freedom of speech was absolute. And we say, no. We've told you continuously throughout our entire 3 speeches, and right now I'm telling you once again, that no right is in its entirety absolute. And the thing is that at the end of the day, we acknowledge that if your freedom of speech infringes on another person's ability to practice their religion, to wear a hijab in public, to hold their hands for a gay couple to hold their hands in public, if you restrict their ability to follow their identity, that freedom of speech is not legitimate. We don't think that that's a right you have. Just because of some arbitrary position you gained in society, you do not have the right as an individual to use your freedom of speech as a freedom to hate and make sure that you restrict other people's choices. It is not an inherent right. They've refused to respond to this one particular piece of analysis which we have given to you throughout our 2 speeches. And as a result, their idea that freedom of speech is absolute falls over there. Now, they told you that the right to identity in this case is not infringed. That was the analysis we frankly preempted and disproved in our very first argument when Karthik told you and illustrated to you how your right to make choices and your right to your very basic identity is harmed. We gave you examples of religion. We gave you examples of sexual orientation. We gave you examples of gender as a whole and told you how in all these cases you are likely to have your choices restricted by this form of speech. We told you why hate speech is extremely harmful to you as an individual. Right? That directly contradicts their entire idea to voice an opinion because it does directly affect people regardless from the physical harm which we stated to you in our second argument. There's another thing. It accumulates in long term. We're not saying that a single form of speech is always the one that's going to restrict a person's choices. What we've given to you throughout our case is a repetition. We've told you that when this speech accumulates, which it will, which is what hate speech characteristically does, it restricts people's choices. That is the analysis they have failed to respond to throughout the end of this side. So what have we proved to you by them not responding to this? Firstly, we've proved to you that this freedom of speech is not absolute, and we proved to you that this freedom of speech does restrict other people's choices, and as a result, we are totally legitimate in curbing down this freedom of speech. But let's look at what else they told you under this small clash point. They told you that if it's in their religion, we believe they should have the right to do it. No, if it's in their religion to make a blood sacrifice every 5 days, that doesn't mean we as a state are going to allow people to do that. At the point at which a person's religion infringes on another person's ability to make choices, we tell you it is not legitimate. Religion cannot be used as a shield to permit individuals to do whatever they want, to infringe on the rights of people who don't ascribe to that very same religion. That is fundamentally illegitimate. The right to religion, we told you on our side of the house, is the right or the ability to practice religion. For Christians to practice religion and be open in the public. For Hindus to walk on a street of a Muslim-dominated area. For Muslims to walk in the streets of France without feeling the need to cover themselves up and run away because they might be harmed in public. That is the right to religious expression. That is the right to religious freedom that we protect on our side of the house. We do not stand for illegitimate forms of right to expression. I'll take a POI if you have one.
Yeah, we talked about comments, not blood sacrifices, and how is making comments not part of practicing religion as
Thank you,
say.
sir. So firstly, the analogy to blood sacrifices mainly just indicates that this random assertion you have that a right to religion is once more not absolute. You cannot tell us that this right to religion is always legitimate. We tell you that when it restricts choices, like a blood sacrifice would restrict a person's choice to life, we have legitimacy in removing that. And clearly we've shown you, and you have not rebutted throughout our speeches, that choice is taken away. That is one established point, which is a takeaway from this debate, uncontested. What's the second clash in today's debate? Does this speech truly cause harm, and is it beneficial to restrict this? What do they tell you under this? They told you that people don't act to this speech, and that it's not really the fault of the speaker if people interpret it irrationally and then use that. That is false. Hate speech usually indicates things like incitement of violence, like go hack that person to death, or that community is full of rapists, we'd be better off with them not on the face of the planet. That sort of stuff is very difficult to interpret in an evil way because it's probably inherently evil in the most place. And we tell you that when it's likely to cause hate, when it's likely to cause people to go against hate, it's not entirely that they aren't absolved of any guilt. When they have intent, as we have shown you throughout our speeches, that they know it's likely to cause hate, and they know it's likely to cause those results, when they do the action and when they cause harm at the end of the day through themselves or indirectly, it is very much a crime. It's not like you don't arrest a person for hiring a hitman to go kill another person. It's just because they don't directly cause the harm, it does not mean they are not complicit or involved in that harm. That directness means nothing to us as a state. We still have every right to prosecute them. Then they gave us this example that propaganda is not within this debate. But let's just look at the difference between propaganda and this hate speech. Fundamentally, we see nearly none. We still see the same amount of repetition. We still see the same amount of convincing those people using strong rhetoric. We still see the same results in public. They needed to come out here and tell you why propaganda was inherently different, not just assert it. But we've given you reasons why we don't really think it's that different. It's still there. Lastly, on their idea on how people can laugh at themselves and how hateful comments don't really cause any violence. No, there is a large difference between a stereotype that Arabs are always late, which might be a playful stereotype, which happens in many places, and a harmful stereotype that several Western and European countries have, that Arab people are terrorists. And that is an extremely big different thing. And the thing is that both those stereotypes exist. And when that harmful stereotype exists, we've shown you how it manifests its actions in real life, and how that actually infringes on the rights of people around the world. We do not stand for that infringement. Last clash point on what does this look like on the long term. Firstly, they did not respond to any of our analysis from our second speaker on how disenfranchisement happens in the status quo and how this policy rather will increase the inclusion of people into society. They've given us no analysis as to why that's unlikely. We take that as a concession from their side of the house, which basically means that we've proved a massive benefit for a large amount of inclusion into society by these minority religions, by these minority sectors. People who are usually disadvantaged are more likely to come and integrate into society under our side of our house. house. That in itself is a massive benefit that will win us this debate if you look at the important things that a state wants to go for. The state in our case is not pushing its criteria. It's not a measure of accountability. This debate at the end has come down to principles. It's not us trying to push our own radical idea on an individual. It's not radical to assume that you can't tell another person to kill that individual based on some sectarian identity that you have. It's not illegitimate for us to restrict this freedom of speech. The right to hate does not exist.
Thank you, Dhananjay, for your speech. It's now my pleasure to ask Yusuf to lead his speech.
I am a Christian Arab. Believe it or not, we exist, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I'm sorry to take this from the personal view, but through our experiences, we as Christian Arabs have suffered through a lot in the past. I mean, we weren't allowed to volunteer during war times. We weren't allowed to do many things in our society because of being Christian Arabs. But how did we get through that? We took it as a joke, ladies and gentlemen. Something that Team Proposition do not believe exists in our society. They believe that once a comment is made, lots of things can change from that, and people could get hurt, and other people, because that's because of one simple reason. Because they fail to engage with the broad meaning of comments in today's debate. Their repetitive case was about hate speeches. And today I'm going to be rebutting the points brought to the table by Team Proposition and prove why, as opposition, we have engaged with this motion more than Team Proposition did. So I believe, or we believe on Team Opposition, that there were three main points of clash in today's debate. First of them being the freedom of speech. So what is the freedom of speech? Is freedom of speech absolute? And does freedom of speech have a negative impact on people? Now, to start off with that, their entire case was built upon, the fact that we are going to practically filter speeches that we believe leads to oppression, ladies and gentlemen. Believe it or not, when you filter speeches, that doesn't mean my opinion is completely, please sit down. That doesn't mean my opinion is cancelled straight away. I will go to people that share the same opinion as me. We have a close community, and we talk about that one point we have. Filtering speeches simply doesn't mean that the opinion I have or the personality I have falls. It actually sparks it, ladies and gentlemen. Because when I discuss it in a closed minority with a close group of people that share similar things, that could actually lead to a greater amount of violence, ladies and gentlemen. Because what happens then is, instead of commenting in public or saying a comment in public, which Team Proposition failed to understand that a comment isn't necessarily a hate speech, then that could lead to more violence, ladies and gentlemen. Now, moving on from that point, freedom of speech, they also asked a wonderful point of information. Will minorities, and I quote, will minorities be able to have access to the same media channels we have? In their world, no. But since you've shown care towards the minorities, we believe that you should actually agree with us and come. We invite you to sit with us on our table, ladies and gentlemen. Because that only the minorities that they care about, how do you expect them to have the access to the media channels we have if you're simply gonna deny or abolish their freedom of commenting? And we believe that the Team Proposition, the case they believe they brought to the table, which we failed to respond to, is the wrong case in the first place. Because they failed to engage with the broad definition of comments. Comments don't necessarily mean a hateful thing. If I were to practice my religion and come out and say something about my religion, which is a comment, say I'm an Arab Christian and I believe in this and this and this. This is a comment that could potentially promote violence or hatred, as the motion states. But it is simply a comment that I believe in. It doesn't necessarily have to be a comment towards another group. So that's what Team Proposition failed to understand in today's motion, and that's why I believe Team Opposition have won. Moving on from that point, they also said that, do people have the right for religious freedom? And we believe that that was a very vital point in today's debate, because they refused to engage with us saying that they were enforcing religious persecution, because they said that you have the right to practice religious, and will your world have religious freedom? But then they said that the right to religion is not absolute. Ladies and gentlemen, how are Team Proposition going to win this debate when they have constantly contradicted their case and defined the wrong case in the first place? Moving on from that point, another key clash in today's debate was, how are we going to reduce societal tension? Which house will be able to reduce societal tension? And we have proven to you today that Team Proposition only sparks societal tension. And here's how. Again, they said that once these comments, as I offered in a point of information, these minorities could discuss their opinions in a closed group and then lead to violence. But they said, we have police that will automatically stop them. Then why do you live in such fear? Why do you live in such fear of a person commenting and releasing his belief to the public if you know that police are there? And if that comment could potentially spark hatred, then why do you live in such fear, dear Team Opposition? Well, actually, they're going to keep discussing them amongst themselves, as they said. So why can the police not stop the radicals that are going to twist the comments in the first place if they are able to stop the other group? Please sit down. On that point, ladies and gentlemen, another thing that is their case, they kept mentioning the right to life and the right to religion, and Christians can practice their religion and open to the public. But if they're practicing their religion and opening it to the public, that's making comments which Team Proposition failed to understand in today's debate. So making a comment doesn't necessarily mean I'm making a hateful comment, but today's motion addresses a comment that could potentially cause hatred, not a hateful comment in the first place.
Fine.
Yes, please.
Which scenario is worse? Our side, where extremists who never would have changed take hate underground, or yours, where the general public is always influenced by hate speech?
Actually, that's the point you don't get. Even if you prison extremists, that doesn't mean, because they're already an expanded group, that doesn't mean that their beliefs are going to be cancelled out. In fact, the point is, if you send them to prison, they're going to spend the entire prison sentence thinking of how they could get revenge on these people that caused that in the first place. So, actually, your point falls on that point. Thank you for reminding me. Now, moving on from that point, that's the point I was actually about to mention, that even if they are in prison, they'd want to revenge, but it won't change their opinion. So, and even let's say, for example, a racist said a racist comment, or someone said a comment that could potentially spark racism and was sent to prison, ladies and gentlemen. What if he clashes with someone of a race that he didn't specifically like? Wouldn't that cause spark within the prisons? Let's see, please sit down. Let's see the solution that Team Proposition would offer. Let's separate the prisons. Let's create a prison for each category in our society. And then, when each one comes out of prison, they would have thought of these in their close prison groups, and there we go. World War III, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe not to that extent, but we are creating a violent society. Yes, please.
Is the right to privilege hatred of entrenched communities more important than the right to expression of vulnerable minorities?
Please repeat that point.
Is the right to hatred of entrenched and privileged communities more important than the right to basic expression of minorities?
Well, the thing is, the right to make a comment, that shouldn't be taken away from the people, because on your side of the motion, you're saying that making a comment could potentially spark or promote hatred. Well, we believe not. Now, the final point that wasn't really major, but was a point in today's debate, was how can you create peace through oppression? And that was addressed through the points of how prison could make an impact and how closed minorities could make an impact. Ladies and gentlemen, I would just like to conclude my speech with putting this analogy on the table. Let's imagine a father that said a comment, practiced his religion through a comment, and was sent to prison because of that. That father has a child. What will his child do? The child that hasn't matured yet, will he think that his father did the right, or will he think that because what his father did and he got sent to prison, that was a wrong thing and that he shouldn't do that? Or will he have hate towards the people that do that? And there we go, a violent society with no manners, and that's why we should agree with Team Proposition. If you, ladies and gentlemen, and the dear everyone attending here, if you think that that's a society we are willing to create. While on Team Opposition, we believe we can take control of this before it gets out of our control. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. for your speech. It's now my pleasure to ask God to give the opposition advice.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an especially special debate because Team Proposition has given us our case today. Because we actually didn't have to do anything because they themselves showed us how through their inherent contradictions their policy will in fact aggravate the situation they strive to prevent, and how that indeed leads to the world that Team Opposition wants. So I just want to thank you in advance for that. So how did this actually come about happening? How did this actually happen? Well, there were four main points of clash in today's debate. The first one being the means of actually achieving the tolerance that Team Proposition wants. The second one being the idea of what constitutes the nature of freedom of speech. The third one being religious freedom, and finally the nature of what actually makes a comment. So let's just dive right into it, shall we? The first one being means of achieving this. How would they actually go about achieving this religious tolerance? Well, according to them, every single thing that you say, which is possibly which is even in the slightest targeted at any given minority group that we're talking about today, deserves to be classified as a criminal offense. And frankly, we don't think the boundaries between the things that people talk about on an everyday basis are as clear-cut as that, and we gave you several examples of that throughout today. The more important second point of clash was the freedom of speech, where they came up here and told us that it was not absolute. However, they also told us that no right is in and of itself is absolute. So there was an inherent contradiction there in their analysis, because they used this basis to come up and show us that the right to other things is greater than the right to freedom of speech. But by inherently calling all rights not absolute, they failed to substantiate that. And really, this was extremely detrimental because of one of the other points that they raised. They said that minorities in our world would not have access to the same sources of media as the elite group, the privileged, entrenched group, as they put it. However, in their world, if these minorities, which are minorities for a reason because they belong to one of these categories we're talking about today, if they choose to make a comment about this richer category, they're going to be classified as having a criminal offense. So in their world, they're the ones which are forcibly creating a special group of society which only conform to a special group of principles, and those are the ones which are not going to be criminally penalized. So on our side of the house today, we believe in a world where there's a much better means of going about achieving tolerance than forcibly having you put in prison for any single remark you make, be it as a result of your religion, be it as a result of something you might not even have control of in the first place. That is the value we're enforcing today. This leads quite nicely to the idea of religious freedom and what constitutes that. In their world, they talked about how they believe that people have the right to practice religion, if I remember correctly. That was one of the firmer points of their argument. However, on our side of the house, that's precisely what we said. If you're practicing your religion, and let's say your religion involves a phobia of a particular group of people that we're talking about today, would you use that as a criminal offense? And yet, they failed to give us any response on that, other than the fact that all of a sudden, though you have the right to practice your religion, that right isn't absolute. That seemed to be a really recurring theme in Team Proposition today. They would defend people's rights and then call them not absolute, as a means of bypassing to pass on empty rhetoric. So that was one of the huge flaws we saw on their side of the house today. Whereas on our side of the house, we showed you that what we're saying is that comments which may or may not inspire hatred do not deserve to be punished by classifying them as a criminal offense. We told you that there are other means of going about enforcing tolerance. We told you that forcibly having these people change their mindset towards minorities is not going to serve to strengthen any community, but it will only serve to exacerbate, aggravate, and damage society. Which is why we believe that a criminal offense is not the way to put an end to intolerance. Thank you.
Thank you, Zad, for your speech. It's now my pleasure to ask Kartik to finish this debate and give the propositions report.
As we told you from our very first speech, repetition is dangerous. When hate speech is predominantly against particular minorities who have been historically disadvantaged, otherized, and alienated, these are people like the Tutsis of Rwanda, the Jews of Nazi Germany, and the Muslims and gay people of today. Because contrary to what Team Kuwait thinks, There are real harms to these people. It's not about Arab timing or black people like watermelons. It's about Arabs are terrorists and black people are criminals. A large part of their case was incredibly assertive but very thin on the ground. We will try to give them the benefit of the doubt, okay? Because we established a clear connection between hate speech and hateful attitudes, between hate speech and crimes. And that's why we win this debate. 2 questions in this debate. First, what rights are the most important to be considered in this debate? And second, which side better reduces the harms of speech? So on the first idea of which rights should we consider here, let's clarify from the outset that no rights are absolute. That's why it's not a contradiction for us to say that this kind of speech threatens people's religious freedom, but then that people's religious freedom is also not absolute and shouldn't threaten other people's life. Right? That's why obviously no rights are absolute, neither freedom of speech nor freedom of religion. That's something they fail to understand. We pointed out to you that in this case in particular, the freedom of speech infringes on other people's rights, on their right to life, on their right to religious freedom. That's why it's legitimate to restrict it. The only response we heard to this was freedom of speech is absolute. We preempted this in the second minute of our case. We told you that there's no reason to consider any right to be absolute. They provided absolutely no justification for considering it an absolute. That's why that simply cannot stand. We also told you, moreover, how speech is a harm in itself, how it attacks these people, how when you are called immoral and degraded by the people around you, that is a harm that is morally indistinguishable from people who are harming you physically. It's simply something that they didn't respond to on their side of the house. The only thing that they could say was that people aren't culpable for harm that other people cause, like through physically. First, our case wasn't contingent on people acting on this kind of crime, right? Obviously, when people attack other people, that's a crime. But our case was also about the harms of speech in itself, what the harms it can cause to these people by its nature and in and of itself. Second, even in these cases, it's not so much that these people are just not culpable because of the fact that quite often there's an intent to harm. Like, these people don't deserve to live. These people are rapists. That's the kind of speech that we are trying to police in this debate. That's the kind of thing that they didn't recognize. On to the second question of which side reduces the harms of speech. We pointed out to you in our single biggest argument, repetition. We reduce it on our side. We reduce the kinds of harms that can come from this repeated speech by filtering out the most hateful ones towards minorities. That's what happens on our side of the house. But on their side of the house, it's more extreme. The mainstream views are filled with the extremist views of people who have hateful views, like Muslims are terrorists. That means they can repeat this to the general public. That means that harm exists even on their side. This means they have all the harms of repetition of speech, but we have none of those. That's why we are the better side in this debate in reducing the harms of speech. Furthermore, we told you that minorities are the ones who are particularly harmed by this culture of speech. They're the ones who can't access the media, who can't have a level playing field in the terms of speech that they can use against majorities who use speech against them. There was no response from them on this point as to how there's no level playing field in access to speech, and there's no way for these people who are oppressed to fight back with speech. The only thing they could say was that the speech will go underground. At PM itself, I said that extremists will always exist. They dropped this in their first and second speech, and at their final speech, they finally picked it up and spun an argument about how people are going to be hateful anyway. This was too late. We already pointed out to you, even in the POI, that it's going to be much worse than the general public is influenced by their opinion. Because we reduced the harms of speech, because the freedom of speech is not an absolute right, and we are legitimate in policing it, we win this debate.